All right, consumer, let's take a look at 7.7, profit and loss for a clothing business. We're going to have some business formulas showing up above the guy, falling down hilariously. Gross profit equals the selling price minus the cost. How much money am I going to make? Let's say I've got an object, I'm going to sell it. Well, I'm going to sell it for $19.99. Well, how much did it cost for me to produce that item? Let's say I'm selling a doorknob for $10. I'm a doorknob business. I make doorknobs, and it cost me $8 to create that doorknob. And I sell it to Joe Schmo off the street for $10. So my gross profit is $2. Now my net profit is my selling price minus my cost plus my overhead. So not just the cost, but there's overhead. That's what it costs to pay my employees. That's what it costs to pay the mortgage on the business that I've built, the physical brick and mortar store. That is how much I pay for CMP for the power bill, etc. So when I add my overhead and my costs together and subtract it out of my selling price, that's my net profit. And the loss is kind of the same thing. Just realize if your the cost to make the item and the overhead is greater, then just realize your bigger number is a negative number in your mind and subtract out the selling price, even though the selling price is a positive. But you'll know if your numbers if you've actually made something, you've had a profit or a loss off of it. Look at model pull number 1. June Jackson bought a dress for $44 to sell in her dress. She estimated her overhead in the dress to be $20.95. She sold the dress, that's the selling price, for $73.50. Find her gross profit or net profit. Well, gross profit is her selling price minus the cost. So that's $44 and minus the $73.50 minus the $44. And she had a gross profit of $29.50. Well, let's go back and figure out all of her overhead and do it though, okay? So her overhead was $20.95 and they bought the dress for $44. So $20.95 plus $44, okay, is $64.95. They sold the dress for $73.50, therefore it was a net profit. It was $8.55, okay? All right, operating statements. This is kind of how businesses operate. How much total business you do as a company minus returns and allowances equals your net sales. Your net sales minus your cost of goods sold. That means what you had to pay in order to get those goods into your store. So let's say I don't make my doorknobs. Let's say I sell doorknobs. I'm a hardware store. But I had to buy those doorknobs from a company that manufactures them. That's my cost of goods sold. I'm going to sell it to you, but I've got to purchase it from a manufacturer to get it in my store before I sell it to you. So my net sales less means minus my cost of goods sold equals my gross profit. My gross profit minus all my expenses, salaries, payroll, rent, utilities, telephone, all that stuff. Add those all up. Remember, those are negative things. Those subtract out of how much money I brought into my business. Look at number 2. Amelia Popov's shoe store had gross sales of $250,000. $14,000 returns and allowances. Her cost of goods were $135,000 and her overhead totaled $83,400. Find A, the net sales, B, the gross profit, and C is net profit. So you just go back to that purple table on the left side of page 210, realizing the gross sales minus the returns and allowances, meaning less, minus, equals my net sales. Subtract it out. It's just a subtraction problem. Just remember this though, if you have like 14 minus, let's do a different number. Let's do minus 6 is 8, minus 3 is 5, minus 4 is 1. This is kind of what's happening. You start off with a bunch of money, and then you have some returns and allowances, and then you have to pay for cost of goods sold, and then you have to take away all of your overhead, the cost to do business. This is what you're really left with. This is the number that actually matters, right? Not how much you brought in totally. But also understand the relationships between these numbers. They may get tricky down in the model problems, or not the model problems, but in the word problems. And they'll tell you this number and this number, but they won't tell you this number, okay? They'll tell you that what the gross profit is, and they'll tell you what the net profit is. But they won't tell you what the overhead expenses were. Just understand the relationship happening here. If I know the top number and the bottom number, how do I find out 5 minus 1 equals 1? Well, I would subtract 1 from 5. Okay? What if they give you the conclusion to the previous problem? They don't give you the conclusion. They don't give you the 5. They don't give you the gross profit, but they give you the total expenses and the net profit. You'd have to add those two together. So understand the relationship between the list that you're subtracting from and the conclusions. they'll probably be pretty good to you and have you find this answer, then have you find this answer, have you find this answer, but they may get a little tricky and take away some of those beginning numbers. Just understand the relationship between those, okay? So 1 through 6, number 1, 51 through 60, the cost is 38, the overhead is 590. Number 1 is 51.6 minus my cost, which is $38. That's my first answer. My second answer is when I take that gross profit and subtract it by 590. You don't have to go back to your original number and add those two together. So this really isn't necessary. It's more cascading. Once I know this, I don't need to add these two together and then subtract out of 14, etc. I can just keep going, right? 7 through 10 is kind of the same thing. Net sales, gross profit, net profit. They're just having you go further down the list on page 210. Instead of just gross profit and gross sales, net sales, gross profit, they want you down to net profit. So one more step, subtracting out your overhead and expenses. So on number 7, it's 165,000 minus 15,200. That's the first answer. Minus 92,000. That's your second answer. Minus 51,600. That's your last answer. And then you got the word problems. Remember this relationship. Okay, that's 7.7, and I trust you're going to do great on it.